Most people think the Federal Reserve loses control in one dramatic moment. I do not. I think the Federal Reserve loses control in stages. First, it loses control of the clean story, then it loses control of the easy choice, then it loses control of how pain gets distributed. And only after all of that do ordinary people finally feel something is wrong. That is where we are now. Not in some cartoon apocalypse, not at the end of America, not in the final collapse of the dollar tomorrow morning. We are in something more dangerous than that. We are in a regime where the central bank no longer has one clean move that solves the problem in front of it without making another problem worse. That is what most people are not ready for. The source you gave me begins with oil jumping, stocks falling, and financial media blaming the immediate move on the UAE attack. Then it pivots to the real point. The Middle East is only the trigger. The deeper issue is that the Federal Reserve has been moving toward this conflict with rising inflation, growing disagreement, and a narrowing set of politically and economically tolerable choices. That is the valuable part of the source. Fay file site Fay turn 69 file 0 Fay. That is the story I want to keep. Because if you focus only on the attack, you will misunderstand the bigger danger. The bigger danger is that an oil shock is hitting an economy that was already too fragile for another inflation surprise, and a central bank that was already too divided for another clean consensus. That is where the real pressure lives. The first mechanism is what I call the policy split. A central bank is strongest when even painful decisions still feel coherent. Not easy, coherent. A coherent central bank can say, inflation is the problem, therefore we tighten. Or it can say growth is collapsing, therefore we ease. The public may hate the decision, markets may resist it, politicians may complain, but at least the machine still knows what it is trying to do. That is not what is happening now. Now, the machine is divided over which fire deserves the water. The source is right to emphasize the 29th of April meeting because that is where the split became public. Reuters reported that 3 regional Federal Reserve presidents dissented over the statement, S remaining easing bias. The most dissents against guidance language in decades because they thought inflation was still too hot for language that leaned toward eventual cuts. AP and other outlets also described the split vote as the biggest dissent pattern since the early 1990s. Fay site Fay turn 889,456 search, 6 Fay turn 889,456 news, 39 Fay turn 889,456 news, 42 Fay that matters. Because dissent inside the Fed is not automatically bad, but sharp dissent at a time when inflation is rising. Again, energy is volatile. And leadership is changing tells you something very important. There is no longer a broad internal agreement on which pain matters most. That is a problem, not because debate is evil, because markets hate not knowing which side of the problem the central bank will privilege first. Will it save growth? Will it defend the dollar? Will it tolerate more inflation? Will it punish inflation harder and accept slower growth? You cannot cut and hike at the same time. That is the whole trap. The second mechanism is what I call the trap mandate. The Fed has a dual mandate. Everybody can recite it. Maximum employment and stable prices. Fine. Those goals look compatible in easy years. They stop looking compatible when inflation rises again while growth softens and energy shocks hit the system from the outside. Then the dual mandate stops feeling like a neat balance. It starts feeling like a knife held at both ends. That is the condition. Now the source says some Fed members want stimulus while others want to protect the dollar. That is a little too retail in its language, but it is directionally correct. One side of the argument fears economic softness and wants easier conditions. Another side fears inflation persistence and wants to avoid giving up too early. Reuters, MarketWatch, and AP all describe exactly that struggle in the latest meeting and handoff environment. Fay file site Fay turn 69 file 0 Fay site Fay turn 889,456 search, 6 Fay turn 889,456 news, 43 Fay turn 889,456 news, 39 Fay. That is the trap. If the Fed eases too fast while inflation is reaccelerating, it risks making the price problem worse. If it stays too tight while the economy weakens, it risks amplifying the slowdown and forcing a harder landing later. There is no clean button to press. That is what lost control really means in a grown-up sense. Not that the institution disappeared, that the institution no longer owns one obvious move. Now let us talk about inflation, because the source gets one very important thing right and one very important thing wrong. It is right that inflation is becoming more serious again. It is wrong when it says PCE itself excludes food and energy. That is not true. Headline PCE includes them, core PCE excludes them. That distinction matters because if you do not understand the measure, you can tell a story that sounds sharp but is actually sloppy. The Bureau of Economic Analysis says the March 2026 PCE price index was up 3.5% year over year, while the core PCE price index, excluding food and energy, rose 0.3% in March. Reuters described March headline PCE at 3.5% and core PCE as in line with expectations. BAS' own data page confirms the 3.5% year-over-year headline figure for March 2026. Faysite Fayturn 889,456 search 0 Fayturn 889,456 search 3 Fayturn 889,456 search 4 Fayturn 889,456 search 7 Fay. Why does that matter? Because the source's deeper instinct is correct, even if the explanation needed tightening. If headline inflation is accelerating and energy pressure is pushing through the system again, then the Fed does not have the luxury of pretending the inflation problem is gone. That is what markets have to deal with, and this is exactly why oil matters so much. Not because oil is just one commodity. Because oil is an input into life. The source says it in the way ordinary people feel at first. Gas costs more, diesel costs more, shipping costs rise, fertilizer costs rise, food eventually costs more, airlines get squeezed, consumers have less left over for everything else. That is the right chain. Fayfalecite Fayturn 69. File 0 Fay, that is the third mechanism, I call it the oil pass, through, when oil rises because demand is booming. That can sometimes coexist with optimism. When oil rises because a geopolitical conflict threatens supply, the character is different. Then the price of oil is not a growth signal, it is a stress signal. That is what makes it dangerous. Reuters reported on May 3 that oil prices jumped after Iran escalated attacks near the UAE and in the Strait of Hormuz, with Brent rising above $114 and WTI above $106 at one point. Reuters also reported this week that oil remains highly sensitive to war and peace signals. With inventory still drawing and supply disruptions unresolved even after large down days. Faysite Fayturn 8700794 News 49, Fayturn 8700794 News 40 Fay, that matters. Because if oil stays high for ugly reasons, then inflation stops being just a statistic. It becomes an amplifier. Higher fuel costs hit consumers. They hit trucking, they hit logistics, they hit food, they hit margins, they hit sentiment, and they hit the Fed's freedom of movement. That is why I keep saying the Middle East story matters economically, even if you do not care about the politics. The market may try to shrug, the economy cannot. Now let me say something even more important. Inflation is not just a price problem, it is a spending problem. The source is strongest when it brings the story back to the household level. If people are already relying on credit cards, already stretched on basics, and then energy costs rise again, they do not just complain more, they spend differently. That is what eventually ripples into the broader economy. Fayfalecite Fayturn 69 File 0 Fay, that is the fourth mechanism, I call it the squeeze consumer. A lot of macro commentary still talks as though the economy is an abstract machine floating above people's lives. It is not. The economy is millions of small decisions made under pressure. Do I fill the tank? Do I buy lunch out? Do I skip the restaurant? Do I delay the purchase? Do I use the credit card again? Do I cut something small? Do I cut something bigger? That is how macro pain travels. It does not announce itself all at once. It moves from household cash flow into corporate revenue, then into hiring, then into margins, then into stock expectations. That is why consumer stress matters so much. The source says Americans are already stretched and relying more on credit cards, and that higher living costs leave less money available for the rest of the economy. That is not just emotional rhetoric, it is the basic transmission mechanism for how inflation pressure starts hitting growth. Fayfalecite Fayturn 69 File 0 Fay, and once you understand that, the stock market stops looking like a separate story. It becomes the forward rumor mill for the same pressure. Now let us go to the stock market, because this is where people usually make the biggest intellectual mistake. They assume that because something is bad news, the only intelligent response is retreat. That is childish. The source is right to reject that. It says there are opportunities in every market. especially when volatility creates fear and forces prices below where long-term owners eventually want to buy. It cites multiple episodes in 2025 and 2026 when geopolitical or tariff shocks caused violent sell-offs that later proved to be buying windows. Fay-Falasite Fay-Turn 69 File 0 Fay, that is the fifth mechanism, I call it the panic discount. A market sell-off is not automatically a good buying opportunity, but real panic often creates one. That distinction matters. You do not buy just because something is red. You buy because the red move has created a better price for an asset you already wanted to own. That is what adults do. And this is exactly where the source becomes much stronger than the average doom channel. It refuses to turn volatility into a reason to stop being an investor. Instead, it treats volatility as the entry condition serious investors prepare for in advance. That is the right mentality. Because if your whole strategy collapses every time markets get ugly, then you never really had a strategy. You had optimism. That is not the same thing. The sixth mechanism is what I call the prepared list. Most people encounter a sell-off with no plan. That is why they panic. They do not know what they want to own. They do not know what price matters. They do not know how much cash to deploy. They do not know whether the move is noise or an actual change in business quality. So all they feel is fear. The source keeps coming back to the same solution. Know what you want to own before the downturn. Then use the downturn to accumulate in phases rather than trying to guess a perfect bottom. Fay-Falasite Fay-Turn 69 File 0 Fay, that is exactly right. Because the perfect bottom does not exist for real people. You discover it only later. The person waiting for perfect certainty usually buys later, higher, and with more regret. The person who buys in phases when good assets go on sale is the one who actually behaves like an investor. That difference matters more than any macro forecast. Now let me say something harder. The source uses 2020 as the emotional proof that timing the exact bottom is usually a losing game. That lesson is stronger than people realize. The 2020 crash was so violent and the rebound so fast that people waiting for more confirmation often got left behind while the market turned without them. The exact path was distorted by Fed action, but that only reinforces the deeper point. In real time, bottoms rarely announce themselves politely. Fay-Falasite Fay-Turn 69 File 0 Fay. That is the seventh mechanism. I call it the false bottom hunt. A lot of people tell themselves they are being disciplined when they wait. Sometimes they are, but often they are just looking for emotional permission. They want the market to stop hurting before they buy. They want the news to feel cleaner. They want certainty that the worst is over. That is understandable. It is also expensive because markets do not bottom when the emotional environment feels safe. They often bottom when the emotional environment still feels insane. That is why I prefer phased buying. Not because it is clever, because it is workable. You accept that you will not nail the exact low. You accept that the market can keep falling after you buy. You accept that you may buy too early in part, and you accept all of that because your real objective is not perfection. It is ownership at better prices. That is what matters. Now, let us go back to the Fed because this story is not only about being a good long-term investor. It is also about understanding the regime you are entering. The source says the Federal Reserve is starting to get more divisive and asks whether Kevin Warsh will deepen the split or unify it in one direction. That is the right question. The details around the handoff matter because a leadership change during an inflation growth conflict is never just personnel. It is a regime question. Fay-Falasite Fay-Turn 69 File 0 Fay Reuters says Kevin Warsh is expected to take over as Fed chair around mid-May, while Powell remains on the board for now. And AP described the latest handoff as highly unconventional and happening after the most serious descent pattern since 1992. Reuters also reported that Warsh is inheriting a fight over whether the Fed should keep an easing bias or stay harder on inflation. Fay-Site Fay-Turn 889,456 News, 38 Fay-Turn 889,456 News, 39 Fay-Turn 889,456 News, 41 Fay-Turn 889,456 News, 43 Fay. That matters because leadership transitions are easiest when the machine has one clean mission. They are most dangerous when the machine is already split. That is what is happening here. The eighth mechanism is what I call the handoff risk. A new chair does not arrive in a vacuum. He arrives into expectations, into factional tension, into political pressure, into market narratives, into the public record of his own prior words. That means the market is not just pricing the economy, it is also pricing the uncertainty of how the new leadership will balance inflation versus growth. That is why I think the source is right to focus on the handoff date, even though I would describe it more carefully than the Fed just lost control. The cleaner way to say it is this: the Fed is entering a handoff at the same moment its operating environment is becoming less coherent. That is enough to create real uncertainty. And markets do hate uncertainty. Not because uncertainty is emotionally unpleasant, because uncertainty widens the range of plausible outcomes. That is what capital hates most. Now, let me say something that almost nobody wants to hear. Higher inflation can help some asset owners even while hurting the average household. The source hints at this in a simplified way when it says higher inflation generally benefits investors. That is too broad if left unqualified. But the deeper point is still important. When money loses purchasing power and hard assets, or productive assets, adjust upward faster than wages, the ownership class gains relative ground on the wage. Only class Fe-Felicite Fe-turn 69 file 0 Fe, that is the ninth mechanism. I call it the ownership wedge. Inflation is not neutral. It widens the difference between people who hold appreciating or inflation-sensitive assets and people who hold only cash and labor income. That is why inflation feels so unfair to so many households, because it is not only making life more expensive, it is silently changing who can keep up. And when the Fed gets trapped between growth fears and inflation fears, that wedge becomes harder to manage. If it eases too soon, it risks widening the wedge further. If it stays too tight, it risks increasing unemployment and financial stress. There is no easy justice there. That is why I say the Fed has lost the clean story. Now let me bring this back to behavior, because behavior is still where most people win or lose. The source says not to become a gambler in the stock market. Good. That is exactly right. If you are always trying to predict tomorrow, S macro headline, next month, S Fed move, or the exact day of the next recession, you are not investing. You are trying to win a prediction contest against people with better data and faster reactions. Fe-Felicite, Fe-turn 69 file 0 Fe, that is the 10th mechanism. I call it the strategy split. A gambler asks, what will happen next? An investor asks, what do I want to own if bad things make it cheaper? That is the whole difference. One mindset is reactive, the other is preparatory. And preparation is what gives you power in volatile markets. The source SAB approach, always be buying through a passive system while also keeping an active opportunistic strategy, is not interesting because of the acronym. It is interesting because it solves the most common behavioral problem. People freeze when fear arrives. An automatic system keeps them in motion even when the news gets loud. Fe-Felicite Fe-turn 69 file 0 Fe that matters, because the investor who depends entirely on courage will often fail. The investor who has a system can keep moving when courage runs low. That is a much better design. Now let me say something even harder. The media is not only noisy, it is structurally biased. The source says financial news exaggerates both the upside and the downside. That is exactly right. In good times it sells euphoria, in bad times it sells collapse. Neither extreme is usually a reliable guide to what disciplined capital should do next. Fe-Felicite Fe-turn 69 file 0 Fe, that is the 11th mechanism, I call it, the noise premium. The louder the coverage, the less useful the emotional framing usually becomes. That does not mean the facts are irrelevant. It means the emotional packaging is usually optimized for engagement, not action. That is why disciplined investors must learn to cut through tone. A stock crash can be terrible news and still a good opportunity. An inflation spike can be painful and still not mean the world is ending. A Fed split can be serious and still not justify abandoning your whole plan. That is how adults think, not by denying reality, by sorting it. Now, let me bring the whole thing together. What is actually happening? Oil is rising for ugly reasons. Inflation is already warmer than where it was. The Fed is more divided than it has been in decades. Leadership is changing. Markets are unsure which side of the mandate will win. Consumers are already stretched. And volatility is likely to stay high as long as the conflict and the policy uncertainty both remain alive. That is the real picture. Fe-Felicite Fe-turn 69 file 0 Fe-Felicite Fe-turn 870794 News 49 Fe-turn 89456 search 4 Fe-turn 889456 search 6 Fe-turn 889456 News 39 Fe. That does not mean collapse. It means pressure. And pressure creates two very different outcomes for two very different kinds of people. For the unprepared, it creates higher costs, more fear, and more emotional mistakes. For the prepared, it creates sale prices, clearer watch lists, and the chance to buy good assets from people who only wanted them while the headlines were comforting. That is the whole game. So if you want the cleanest version of this entire lesson, here it is. The Fed has not lost control in the theatrical way most people imagine. It has lost the luxury of one easy answer. That is enough. Because once the easy answer disappears, the cost of every next move rises. If it fights inflation harder, growth can weaken more. If it protects growth too quickly, inflation can bite harder again. If oil stays high, the whole argument gets nastier. If consumers keep weakening, markets will feel it. If markets crack, prepared investors will get opportunities. If they are unprepared, they will get fear instead. That is why this moment matters. Not because you should hide, because you should get your strategy honest, know what you want to own, know what price would excite you. Keep cash if you need flexibility. Keep buying in phases if your horizon is long. Do not wait for the perfect bottom. Do not let the media wrench your nervous system. Do not ask the Fed to give you certainty it no longer has. That certainty is gone. What remains is your process. And in a world where the central bank has lost the clean story, process matters more than prediction ever will.